People focusing on the same task for a long time and remaining vigilant eventually become distracted, irritable, and impatient. Think about your mental state at the end of a 6-hour online FPS jag or a protracted raid in an MMO. If you're anything like me, it's probably somewhat agitated. But interestingly, switching to another activity, especially one that is low stress, or even more interestingly, one that contains pastoral scenes of nature, almost immediately restores our ability to be vigilant within a few minutes, which I think probably explains the patterns of self-guided player activity that we see in games like Skyrim, as we kind of cycle between exploration and more intense combat, and then less intense and sometimes lengthy periods of just noodling around in our inventory. Now, this need that we have to rotate between different tones and intensities of visual activity probably explains why movie makers talk about pacing. Here on the left is an intensity graph that the writer-producer Warren Scarron made for the movie Top Gun, as well as Freytag's famous triangular graph of dramatic structure, and Kurt Vonnegut talking with graphs about the shapes of stories. I'd definitely check out this video on YouTube. And we certainly think about pacing a lot when we're planning the Uncharted games. And we space out intense periods of combat with less intensive exploration and problem solving, and with experiential sequences like Uncharted 3's Lost in the Desert montage. So to wrap this section up, I quickly want to tell you about the two different kinds of attention that we have. The first kind is something that I've been exploiting every time I bring up a new slide, using what's called your orienting reflex. Now, this big change in your visual field has almost certainly succeeded in attracting your attention to the screen where I want it to be, and it does so in a way that you don't have any real control over. Sudden loud sounds and motion in our visual field also have the same effect, as do the mention of your name, anything that threatens your survival, and just plain novelty, anything kind of new and different in your sensory environment has a tendency to attract your attention. Now, this is called reflexive attention, and broadly speaking, it happens at the back and at the sides of the brain. The other kind of attention that we have is executive or voluntary attention. This is the attention that we are in charge of, which we choose to direct, which we have what's known as executive control over. Now, executive attention is one of a group of executive functions, which also include things like problem solving, decision making, and the way that we monitor our own actions. And this takes place primarily in the front of the brain. But executive attention can be tricked, as it struggles to organize the world. And it has a tendency to assume that the world is continuous and predictable. You might be familiar with the brilliant person swap stunts pulled by the British illusionist Derren Brown, where a victim, the woman in the white shirt, ends up giving directions to two different people without even realizing that the person they're talking to has changed. It's uncanny. She doesn't bat an eyelash. Now, the whole spectrum of executive functioning, where we make choices and take actions, is right at the heart of our craft as video game developers. This is what we're talking about whenever we talk about agency. But it seems that we rarely talk about what the player is choosing to pay attention to. I wonder if that's because our executive attention is kind of out of sight, out of mind. In any case, I think we shouldn't forget that the players of the games that we design have a freedom and a capacity to express themselves simply by choosing what to pay attention to next, before they even take an action. And I don't know that the mainstream of video games often take advantage of this in a thoughtful way. And I'll admit to often being guilty, as a character action game designer, of thinking of the player as pretty reflexive, running from one shiny thing to the next that we've placed in their path. Games like the contemplative Dear Esther and the atmospheric Proteus take a quite different approach, of course. Proteus, which was developed by Ed Key with a reactive ambient score by David Kanaga, is one of my favorite games of 2011. And if you enjoy meditative, interactive experiences and you haven't yet played Proteus, I implore you to seek it out. So anyway, that's a 10-cent tour of what cognitive scientists know about attention. If you're interested, there's lots more good stuff to learn about this on Wikipedia. So attention is probably important for game designers, right? Like other kinds of entertainment designers, we have to guide our audience's attention to the things that enrich their experience. And we have to steer their attention away from the things in our game that don't or won't. For example, game designers specializing in level layout use the weenie technique that we borrowed from theme park design to orient the audience's attention to these landmarks in the environment that poke up over the nearby things. And then we provide kind of sequences of cues and revelations on the paths that guide the players where they choose to go, having oriented themselves to these weenies. So if we're going to talk about the ways that video games get and hold our attention, instead of talking about immersion, we'd better take a quick look at some of the ways they do it. When I first sat down to think about this, I decided that most attention grabbers and keepers in video games fall into one of these three categories: beauty, story, and gameplay. Now, this list seemed like a pretty good starting point, but it was going to change the more I thought about it. So let's begin with beauty. The simplest thing that I could think of that gets my attention in a video game is great art. You can talk about beauty in terms of symmetry, coherence, harmony, and ideal forms. You can also express it with logic and number. We know about the complementarity of color, the golden ratio, and the Fibonacci sequence. But when I thought about it some more, beauty didn't seem to be quite the right word. Not everything that gets our attention like this is traditionally beautiful. Think about the striking work of H.R. Giger, or how much of the art we love is cute or zany. So I thought that maybe a better word than beauty was aesthetics. That way we can include a wider range of tastes and philosophical ideas as well. But then I started looking for a way to describe this in even more general terms, by talking about something that draws attention to itself by virtue of its difference from those things around it. So I decided to think like a graphic designer or an interface designer and call this contrast. That way, this category can include anything in our sensory field that leaps out at us, that grabs our reflexive attention in a way that is useful to our executive attention. Now, things in this first category, beauty, aesthetics, contrast, easily get our attention, I think. They grab it quite powerfully in ways that we don't have that much resistance to. However, these kinds of things don't hold our attention for that long. Think about the way that people only spend an average of 30 seconds or so looking at even the most famous paintings in the world. We easily tire of the contrast in a scene, and our attention needs to move on to something else. So my second category starts out as story. Now, of course, story is a hot-button topic for game developers, as you'll know if you've been reading Kama Sutra in the last few years. My hope is that if we talk about it in terms of attention, then we can make it less loaded as a subject. Story and games are almost certainly the oldest human cultural traditions, and both of them demand and occupy our attention. Think about an early human shaman holding his village entranced around a fire with his tales of the gods and the birth of the universe. However, unlike the linear story that's woven into the playful space of the Uncharted games, not many video games have a story in a traditional sense. And so I pretty quickly changed this section to narrative, to encompass many different kinds of games, from Rockstar's brilliant systemic narratives, all the way over to Daniel Ben-Mehi's new game, Storyteller. I think even the fact that a rook is shaped like a castle and a knight is shaped like a little horse is narrative. Thank you, sir. But to generalize even more broadly, this is all to do with social stuff. A 2007 study at Florida State University showed that we exhibit something called attentional adhesion, not only towards people that we are attracted to, but also towards people that we perceive as rivals for those attractive people's affections. Now, suddenly, it seems scientifically comprehensible, the interest that we all, men and women, gay and straight alike, have in the attractive, noble, crafty cast of Downton Abbey. So opening the door to the social in this way will also let us talk about how social games of all kinds hold our attention. Whether it's the split-screen co-op games of Uncharted 3, or the social aspects of Facebook games and all of the other social games we've been playing recently. The developmental psychologist Michael Tomasello has written about something called the joint attentional scene. And he describes how a shared experience of a third thing plays a fundamental role in our intellectual and social development. And it might even be what gives us our essential humanity. Professor Janet Murray, author, of course, of Hamlet on the Holodeck, has run with the idea of joint attention in the direction of games. And you should check out her work. You can find it online. And thinking about the social also made me think that this is why we've had so much success with the character-driven stories in the Uncharted games. By putting a focus on the people in the game, their fears and hopes, and the moment-to-moment nuances in the relationships between them, we've been able to get and hold people's attention much more easily than by trying to use kind of more abstract, dry, plot-driven stories that many video games use and which focus on the power structures or the history of a fictional world.